it all hinges on this, kids. Did Joseph see God the Father and Jesus Christ in the grove? And then all of a sudden you're like, I don't know. According to this one, no. But according to this one, also no. But this one, yes. Well, don't be stressed.
Well, it's just because we're talking about such crazy stuff today.
Yeah, it's big.
It is. And without further ado,
Shall we do intros?
let's do some intros.
Okay, so I'll start it off. We're going to keep it pretty brief here. Zach Baxter grew up in the Utah bubble, which will have significance as we continue to talk. But lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for 4 years between the ages of 8 and 12. Grew up a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Spent 22 months in Argentina trying to convince people to believe in my God in their language. And that's me so far.
That's phenomenal. My name is Spencer. Also grew up in Alpine, close to Zacharias. And, very similar background. Grew up as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Also served a mission. I used the word served. I should have used lingo such as I went to South Africa and worked with people there doing missionary work. Also,
Probably
of the
chopped some wood
convincing
and
nature.
served
Ah.
little old ladies
Yes.
and such.
What do you
Yeah.
and what do
We
you
did a lot
believe
of
now?
Service.
We did a lot of gardening. I believe that here's a concise statement. The only thing I know is that I know nothing.
That doesn't make sense.
It's a very good point. It makes zero sense.
I'm pondering on the impossibility of that statement.
almost would be a good
yeah, like
injection.
the only thing I almost know.
Only
is that
thing
I
I know is that I almost don't know.
Yeah, I don't know anything, but I do try to progress in my life.
Wise words.
Thank you. Not
From a
very
wise man.
Not wise at all.
I mean, but even never mind. We're already jumping into it.
All right.
Brian.
So my name is Brian. Also grew up in a similar vicinity to these gentlemen. Also grew up as not a member of the church that they mentioned, but of the Mormon church, because it's the same
Oh
thing.
my gosh, he went there.
It's just a rebrand.
Blasphemy.
It's a rebrand, okay? And it's just more words, right? So I grew up also a member of the Mormon faith, also served a mission, and now I would consider myself an agnostic, meaning I do not know. I have suspicions and believe that the likelihood that the church and the faith that I grew up in is not the only true church as I was taught, and also have a belief that the likelihood of an existence in a deity is rather small. Although I am always looking for further light and knowledge, and I love changing my mind and learning that I'm wrong. Sorry, I
Andy?
tapped the mic.
No, it's all good. Didn't spike. I'm Jordan. Grew up in Alpine, even closer to Zacharias than Spencer. Just down the hill, Center Street. I ripped my skin up multiple times on that road. Grew up in Alpine in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Mormons.
Mormon church.
The Mormon Church.
Latter-day Mormons. Mormon Day Saints.
Ooh, Mormon Day Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ
of the Mormon Day Saints. I also went on a mission to next door to down the hill, slightly from Zach, in Chile, where I taught little old ladies and old men with no legs and such. My current
gonna be so
belief,
misleading.
I know that.
For anybody who doesn't
anybody.
know what
Like
we're
he
talking
And
just,
anybody.
He just pauses. He just
No,
goes straight
no,
to no
no.
legs.
Well, I did
like,
baptize a man
for
with no
the
legs.
for the one time that
He really didn't talk to too many people. He just only talked to
I
people without
targeted
legs.
the no legs guys.
I taught little old ladies with no legs. Anyone else? I was not
All
in
four
charge.
of them in the entire country.
Yes. Well, and my belief would be it's more complex than saying I don't know or I know. I would say there are many things that I do know. I'm currently an active member of the LDS faith and
Mormons?
of the Mormons, and I believe in a higher power. I believe in God, and I believe that I have a relationship with Jesus Christ.
Love it. And I should have mentioned as well, and you need to get into your
Yeah, I
beliefs
didn't go
just a
as deep.
tiny bit, but like as well in my saying that I don't know things, I certainly have my leanings with different topics as to what I believe, but then as it pertains to the divine or God or Heavenly Father and Christ, I do have a belief in the divine. I would say I have a belief in the divine. I don't know exactly how it's
Is deity the same
exactly
thing
what
as
it is,
dark
but
matter?
Might be.
Who knows?
That's why you can lift so much with them legs. Squatting some angels.
Atlas.
The power of agnosticism.
And are you gonna touch?
Yeah, so I'll just, I think fundamentally, if you wanted to break down some of my beliefs, it would just be, I believe that everybody, whether they want to or not, believes in many things. And regardless of whether or not you believe you have a knowledge of things or if you have a debatable knowledge, I think that faith in both a religious and non-religious context is kind of fundamental to human psyche. Just
But
the
what
way
do
that
you
we view the world.
believe?
I believe in God. I believe that I have a relationship with Jesus Christ. I believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints,
Mormons?
a.k.a. the Mormons, possess certain elements of truth. And again, we're going to really dive in after this.
But if I were to ask, do you believe it is the only true church on the face of the
I
earth?
don't know if
Yes.
that's okay. Well, good.
Okay.
Yes.
If he says yes, I just feel like that's an interesting question that is
Yeah.
more.
I mean, we can jump into the meaning of that statement, but
an
I think
answer.
for what he's asking, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, we'll dive
You're wrong.
Oh, gosh.
How dare you say such a thing?
So
You
it
hate gay
begins.
people.
You're playing with the big boys now.
Awesome. Isn't that great?
The power of
I
Ra.
love that you just said yes. I love it
I
dearly
do.
because it's a statement. It's where you're at. You know what I mean? And
I don't
think
love it.
that's-
I think you're short-sighted. You're large-skulled.
Personalities are developing right.
I
here,
love
right
Speaking
in
of,
front
I
you.
think we're going to talk about other large skulls tonight, aren't we?
This
Oh,
gasoline
yeah.
mixture that he's drinking is
Neanderthals.
Neanderthals.
Oh, sorry. My bad. Is that the meaning of Neanderthal? Large skull or
No,
something?
they have very thick,
thick skulls,
Very thick.
like
They,
crab and goyle.
they inhabited much of the European region in colder climates, and they needed more thick protection
They had
against
tough noggins.
extreme weather.
So
But
they built up
they
their
had the
heads?
cognitive
I feel like there are other elements of the
It's
body that are
cold out
susceptible
here.
to
It's a good thing my head's
hypothermia.
thick.
to draw in
Like,
caves.
it's chilly, but my skull could not be harder right now.
Yeah, they're thinking logically, like my frontal cortex is not functioning.
You know,
nearly
my
as
body
much
may
as it
go, but
should.
they'll never get their hands on my neurosynapses.
All right, Zach, read us
Those
Oh, yeah.
these quotes.
So we'll
and let's
start with
jump into a discussion.
some quotes that are probably, you could say, foundational for a Latter-day Saint belief. And actually, these quotes are coming directly from former presidents / prophets, seers, and revelators of the church who are believed to be the mouthpiece of God in the church. So I had to pull up, and I apologize that it's not here now. But we'll hop into the notes. This first one is Gordon B. Hinckley. When I was interviewed by Mike Wallace on the 60 Minutes program, he asked me if I actually believed that, referring to the first vision. Yes, sir, he says, that's the miracle of it. That is the way I feel about it. Our whole strength rests on the validity of that first vision. It either occurred or it did not occur. If it did not, then this work is a fraud. If it did, then it is the most important and wonderful work under the heavens. Then a previous prophet, Ezra Taft Benson, said this was the prophet Joseph Smith's statement. He testified that the Book of Mormon was the most correct of any book on earth and the keystone of our religion. A keystone is the central stone in an arch. It holds all the other stones in place, and if removed, the arch crumbles. like, I don't want this to come off like it's any sort of criticism towards people who no longer believe in the church when they experience a crisis of faith or whatever the case may be. But I personally am a believer in the phrase that challenges don't build character, they reveal character. So I think that faith untested is maybe not quite faith. But I feel like I've been very fortunate in that when I was 14, I was at EFY, and we were having our testimony meeting, which is at the end of the week. It's like kind of the culmination of the whole experience. And we had a couple counselors who were probably, I imagine, mid-20s or whatever, who were just like, hey, and if you don't have a testimony, that's okay. And if you want to bear your testimony about not knowing if it's true, that's okay too. And I remember that I was one of those people who stood up, and I think it was 14 or 15, and I said, I don't know if the Book of Mormon is true. And I said that, and I was like, but I really have enjoyed this week. And I was like, and if anybody wants to talk with me,
You're all my best friends.
then let's talk. And we were close. We had a couple meetings after EFY or whatever, and that was great. And then I've subsequently, growing up, I had a couple leaders who, in more private conversations would say, I really struggle with polygamy.
Yeah.
And they're like, and it's just something that I'm working on. And so I guess I had some exposure to people who were
Challenged.
working on their faith. Mid-flight.
Which is actually surprising, being from Alpine, and anyone from Utah would understand this. I feel like Alpine is like so orthodox. It's like almost 30 years behind where like even like Lehigh is in terms of what they'll discuss.
Would you consider Alpiners?
Really?
Yeah, after Brian's comment.
Would you consider Alpiners? What's the word?
Rich?
No. Like religiously. Like how do we refer to people in like terrorists, Islam terrorists? They're
Zealots?
extremists. Would you consider Alpiners religious extremists?
I think that's going to very much depend on the perspective of
Yeah.
each
Yeah,
individual.
I would say Orthodox, probably.
I would say very
quite
orthodox, but not extremist.
Okay.
Fundamentalist.
I think extremist is the
perhaps?
wrong word.
I think there are,
Just because it's associated with a
By
group
the
that
way-
you don't like.
Well,
because you're racist.
Because in Alpine you also have what we call less actives or whatever, and so they would
Yes.
definitely
Satan's
not be
children?
considered
1%.
extremists, and so you would say maybe casual at best.
Right.
And so
Casual.
to say, obviously there could be a reputation where the majority or a large portion are what we would call probably orthodox. I don't know if we really have to dive into that. But
So
go ahead.
let's bring it back to this for
Yeah.
just a minute, because I want to hear your guys' perspective on this. So what happens when we're talking first vision, particularly here? Because Larry King asks him, so you believe that Joseph Smith saw God the Father and Jesus Christ in the grove of trees at the age of 14.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when someone runs across, say, another account of the first vision in Joseph Smith's personal journal, where only the Lord appears, nothing's mentioned about, true churches or not, and his sins are forgiven, right? And that's his personal handwriting. So how do you, and not to mention, he was also, in his 16th year in that version. So he was 15. So technically we were only 199 years from when it was, but we're having the bicentennial, 200th year since the first. So there's these challenging aspects of faith, right? So what I guess, what should a person do when they come across information like that, where it's like, it all hinges on this, kids? Did Joseph see God the Father and Jesus Christ in the grove? And then all of a sudden you're like, I don't know. According to this one, no. But according to this one, also no. But this one, yes. So you see the complexity of that.
Oh yeah. So and then another, I guess, anecdote from me growing up is, does anybody remember God's Army? There's a
No.
movie.
Yeah.
There's a movie called God's Army.
I only knew about it because of Singles Ward. They made a joke.
Oh yeah.
No.
I got
Anyways,
God's
Army came out.
I thought
think-
that was. Never mind.
I don't
Yeah,
know the
Saturday's
year.
Warrior.
I think
got
that
Saturday's
the
Warrior
year
on
that
DVD.
That's what it is. Not God's Army.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, no. So there was a movie, God's Army, that came out. I don't know which year. I think we lived in Charlotte at the time, so I'm gonna say it was somewhere between like 95 and 2002, somewhere in there. I think God's Army came out, and there's actually a scene in there where there's a group of 4 missionaries sitting at a restaurant, and one of the missionaries sitting at the table says, "Did you guys know that Joseph Smith gave 4 different accounts of the first vision?" And as soon as he said it, the senior missionary goes, "They were given it 4 different times under 4 different circumstances," and I was somewhere between the ages of like 8 and 13 or so. And I was like, what?
And God's Army is it's a faith promoting
Oh
film,
yeah, no,
right?
it
Okay.
definitely.
It's
the
not
ending
I
a
of
would
the-
say
church.
it's,
It wasn't made by the church, but it was definitely.
no, it's a Richard Dutcher film,
He
and he
since
subsequently
has
made
left
other
the
films
church.
and left the church also.
he did a good job just like questioning things. It wasn't a
Yeah, yeah.
movie about. It wasn't like the best 2 years where it was like an uplifting faith. This
Got
is
it.
true.
Yeah.
It
So,
was very much.
so what
like,
happened when you experienced
There's
that?
imperfections.
So
Yeah.
as a kid, I was like, oh, I didn't know that, and I'm pretty sure I asked my dad, like, well, what's that about? And he's like, I don't remember what his answer was.
But
but
it
I
was
mean-
good enough for you to forget about it.
I definitely didn't forget about it. I think. So I mean, if I wanted to look at what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at the quote from President Hinckley, I know that this going into the specifics of your concerns is not going to address that for everybody.
Oh, yeah.
But he says the strength rests on the validity of that first vision. Either it occurred or it did not occur. He doesn't say either it occurred when Joseph Smith was 14 years old or 16 years old. I mean, so perhaps what is traditionally taught in the church misses the mark on what it was really like. For example, in our teacher's quorum with a bunch of 14-year-old boys, we had a lesson about the seer stone being used more than the Urim and Thummim in the translation of the Book of Mormon.
Incredible to me.
So,
That is, I mean, can I just say that is rare
right.
for I mean, maybe
For 14-year-olds to hear about?
Yeah,
Is that what you're
yeah,
saying?
And get this.
I
Well,
never
it sounds
heard
like
about
a
And
lot
get
of
this.
Zach's
Get this.
childhood was quite rare.
Yeah.
A
actually,
14-year-old was teaching the
especially his
lesson.
testimony.
Oh, nice. Way to
So
go.
it wasn't even a leader saying like, now guys, we're going to talk about
the
something that can
14-year-old
be-"
was Joseph Smith. We're all
No.
like,
Yeah, he stepped through the veil and said, "Listen, I have a message." No. So it wasn't one of those settings where the leader comes in and real somber like says, "We're going to talk about something that can challenge your testimony. We want you to all have an open mind." It was literally this kid on his phone. He connected it to a USB into the laptop on his not the laptop, but he had his phone. It was connected to the TV, and he created 27 quiz questions. And one of the questions was something like, did he use the Urim and Thummim or the seer stone more? And I learned something because when I grew up in the church, they were like the Urim and Thummim was 2 clear stones, is what I remember hearing.
yeah, two
That's-
clear
turns
stones
out
and a breastplate.
turns out that's not the case. That the Urim and Thummim was like
full
like a
chest
chest plate
wear.
with like a
Yeah.
glasses, and the reference to 2 stones was the fact that Joseph Smith used 2 different stones as seer stones to translate the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Another question that
also
that
the
this
hat.
child gave, I don't know, said that he talked about how Joseph Smith said that he would look into a hat, into the seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon because he needed the lighting to be better, to be able to see through the
Dude,
stone.
whoever this kid's father was
Right?
that prepared
No.
this
Wow.
questionnaire.
Continues to
I mean,
elaborate.
did you know
It's-
this? Did you know this?
This
All
this
the
is
stuff
stuff
he's
that I've
saying?
discovered in like the last
I
4
know
years.
Oh,
it now.
I-
but I didn't know it.
There were
as a
elements-
teenager,
I didn't
no.
know it until
Well,
3
I,
there were
years
I
ago.
elements
did
of this
know
lesson
about
where
the
I
hat.
very much I had thought that the Urim and Thummim was 2 clear stones. Turns out, oh no, it was 2 stones that were used along with the Urim and Thummim. And so even then, like the culture or the colloquial history within the church was mistaken and made errors in the way that we were passing down this information.
right.
And it was
Big
wild.
game
Like,
of
and he
telephone.
he even talked about the fact that like these stones weren't like remarkable stones inherently,
Right.
and that it was more like Joseph Smith saw a stone in a river, said, "This looks really cool,"
Yeah, or
and
in a
then
well.
then you could say through whatever process, theologically speaking, it became a consecrated or a sacred
Alchemy.
stone that was capable of perceiving these things.
Right.
Think we're
So,
losing some
yeah.
So
Can I
probably
share?
on this.
Can I share my
Yeah.
response to your question? So
Yeah.
I think there's kind of 2 approaches when you hear something like that, history about the Mormon faith that is concerning. There's multiple versions of the first vision. There's things that obviously stem out from there. Many other concerning historical things. There's 2 ways to approach it, right? I think one approach is, we are taught that God is not meant to be believed in logically, but yet there's this principle that we call faith that is essential in order to follow God. And if that's true, then there would be, if faith is essential, then we believe somehow that God would give us reasons or find ways to weed out the logical only thinkers that don't have access to or don't rely on faith, right? So I think that's one way to justify historical inaccuracies is God has given us things to confuse us logically so that we rely on our spiritual, our hearts rather than our brains. Again, the only reason that this stuff is important is that the question is not, is the Mormon faith good, right? Because no one's
really questioning that.
Very few people are questioning that. The question is
it
this
the
true?
only
Is it
true?
the only true church or not? For me personally, that's a mute point. It doesn't matter to me whether it is or not. It matters whether it brings goodness into our lives. And so I do think there's this big focus right now on, is it true or not? In all reality, there's no way that in my opinion, there's no way that we can know because I don't accept a feeling as a witness from God, knowing all, human psychology.
And to Gordon B. Hinckley's credit, he said, that's the way I feel, right? He said, do you believe it? Well, that's the way I feel, which I think is an interesting point. But then to add to what you're saying, Brian, is that the real complex part for me comes down to we are very specific with the way we teach it now, right? On missions, it all comes from, the Joseph Smith history version that was 1838, right? It's very specific. And there were some primo things we learned, right? Which is God the Father has a body, Jesus Christ has a body of flesh and bone. They're two separate beings. I mean, these are like major doctrines that are part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So what makes it really hard for me is when there are conflicting accounts that take away that knowledge.
Yeah, those you would think
the 1832 account specifically, and even the 1835, where there's only one being that's appearing. Now all of a sudden I'm confused. If just Christ appeared to him, how did we learn such a specific piece of information that that we use as just like as basic understanding? Here's some basic understanding. God the Father has a body, and it's like, whoa. That's where it gets really hard for me to wrestle.
I know there's that. So my Elders Quorum president mentioned that the church now has a podcast that is diving into this kind of historical stuff. And there was some psychologist that was saying how it's logical that there's multiple versions of the first vision because when you are in various different circumstances,
you explain it differently.
You explain a story in a different way.
I listened to this whole thing.
I don't doubt that there's some truth to that, but there are some fundamental pillars in terms of there's some key fundamental blocks in terms of a story, and those fundamental blocks just being there sometimes and not being there.
Right.
It to me says
and especially the fact that we use the word testimony in church, and in a way you're asking about what is Joseph Smith's testimony of what happened, and if he was in court. And he was being interrogated, like, if he was to give 4 different versions, that would just be like, I don't understand why we're getting different versions of the story. Like, there should be one concrete experience, right?
And granted, they're years and years apart, and not to mention, 1832 account is the first time it's ever written down. I don't know if you guys remember.
What
this,
if he had early onset Alzheimer's
I always thought
and just
he was,
forgot?
I always thought he was bullied for this whole talking about having a vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ, because that's the way he explains it in the 1838 account. Right. But the reality is,
Joseph, you had any visions lately?
Yeah, exactly. So that's how I thought it always was. But the reality is, those things, he hadn't said anything about God the Father and Jesus Christ until he wrote it down in his personal journal.
How do you know that he
just
didn't say
just
anything?
from when people started mentioning in their own personal journals that when Joseph had claimed a vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ, it all came from 1832 and later. So when he had written it down in his journal, which is 12 years after the event, right? I think most of the bullying in his life came from treasure hunting. That's really like that was where all the pestering, him being able to see visions in stones and see where treasure is and all of that was most of the pestering that happened to Joseph.
I was thinking about that last night, actually, because the story that we're told is that, Joseph Smith growing up, his family moved around a lot because they they were being tried by the Lord and they had famine and all this stuff. But it sounds and it seems historically like they came from a treasure hunting background and just were unwise as to how to manage their lives.
Finances.
I think this is an opportunity for homework. I'll be completely honest, and I know I have read a couple. I've read the different accounts. It's been
yeah.
so long that I really could not have an educated conversation around discrepancies between them.
And maybe
And
maybe I'm already
No.
diving too deep. But
No.
Yeah.
the only reason I do it is to explain the complexity
Oh.
that happens in the brain when someone says, "I know it,"
Yeah.
but versions.
Yeah.
No. I'm
Yeah.
not saying we stop the topic at all.
Yeah.
I'm just saying for the progress of these views, kind of the ideas that we've had is that we would have an opportunity to maybe review and discuss next time
Yeah,
what
and
we
fact
learned
check
with
ourselves.
subsequent study, because we're talking about
Sure.
it seems that there was bullying that was more related to his treasure pursuits, or
Yeah.
they were moving around, but I think it was more economically based than like maybe spiritual challenges. Well, let's if there's something we can do to come
Yeah.
back and say, you know what, from our layman's uncredentialed experience, we were able to do some research, and
Sure.
we believe that based on what we've learned that it may have been an economically based move. It had maybe had more to do with like misuse of funds or whatever the case may be.
And this may be a good opportunity to tell everyone that there will be a segment after the show called
Toots.
Thoughts on
On
our
thoughts.
So if anything I've said, which probably I have said some things that are inaccurate, that'll be an opportunity to fact check, do some research, and actually make sure that what I'm saying is accurate, or what any
Yeah.
of us
Sure.
say
Sure.
is
Right.
right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's definitely important.
Yeah. So for the most part, I think it's easy to get bogged down in like the history of all of the church and its founding and the restoration. And when you actually delve into it, like we somewhat did just now, it does distract, at least for me, it distracts from like, okay, the real point. And that goes back to what Brian's
Yeah,
point was.
is it true? Is it the only truth, or is it
Right.
good? Which I think should be the focus.
Yes, I
Yes.
totally agree with that. And so is it good, and is it, I don't want to
But
use the
is-
word
so in
archetypal,
other
but
words-
does it resonate with
Yeah.
the human spirit,
Yes.
with the soul? And the history, as much as a lot of Orthodox Mormons are into the history, like a lot of the older
Right.
generation, I just never resonated when they started talking about pioneers. I'm out. I'm sleeping.
Yeah.
And because it feels to me like the doctrines of goodness, the principles, faith, hope, charity, were really the point of it all.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not this history, not Hans
Yeah.
Mill and the sacrifice thereof.
But in some ways, I feel like we create our own monster.
Oh yeah.
With
oh
that,
yeah.
with that,
because
and-
it's
and
either
that's-
you
that's
believe
the
it or
point I'm
you
getting-
don't.
Yes,
Right,
That's the
and it
point I'm
goes
getting
binary.
to
extreme on
is that now we
believer
have to
side
be.
and non-believer side.
The only reason people get
the
so
history.
obsessed with history is because of that claim,
Yeah.
the black
They
and white
have
claim.
to.
And,
Well,
I
and
feel like they
I think
must.
another
And it's
thing-
fear on both sides. It's
we
fear.
have to answer this question: is it the only? And I think if we just
There's nerves.
based ourselves
Right.
on
Yeah.
this is goodness.
A couple things that are coming out to me here is I think that there is utility in keeping a church history, simply because we look at the Bible, and hypothetically, if it's true and it's the Word of God, then we're trying to relate to the application of teachings from God 2,000 years apart. Which that was a totally different lifestyle, totally different, like even language was used.
But they had
differently.
all the answers, Zach.
Well, no,
they
so
had all the answers.
my point in saying that is that even trying to understand like the word usage from 1800s and 1900s is a challenge, but it's still more recent. So maybe there is a focus on understanding the history to see how these spiritual journeys have been undertaken as we've progressed through society in general. And then we bring in the fact that it became a worldwide church. So then we're seeing its application outside of a Judeo-Christian country. You know, explain, because I think a lot of the criticisms too is that like the church is so local and that it's created this culture just specifically in Utah. And you're like, okay, well, that maybe that's true. Maybe there's been this kind of maybe the people of Israel are in a season of like struggle where maybe God's not happy with this, you know, and we're straying from like maybe the core concepts of the gospel. But then you also need to say, well, then explain. I a story of somebody who is from Pakistan and has no conception of, well, who comes across the Book of Mormon and then ends up getting baptized years later, and they run branches in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, so there's a little bit of a difference there of like, well, where was the nostalgia there? Where was the, explain the converts that don't have a Christian background, and again, you could argue that there's so many people in the world that it's just going to land on some people and they're going to like it.
Sure.
But that's not really the main point I wanted to make, other than just saying that it's interesting that we're seeing the evolution of a message or the reception of a message through various periods of history.
Sure.
And then I had another one, but I can't think of it.
I think I would argue that over time as well, like as it pertains to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I think we will see a shift from black and white thinking
To goodness.
to goodness. And
I do
think,
as well.
I think
In and out.
more and more the emphasis will be on message, on principles, and less, which it always
and
has
eternity.
been.
I
Yeah.
think there's going to be a
But-
little bit of
But less on this.
that'll be the
like,
debate.
We're the only.
Can
we're
I
the
throw
only.
a scenario out that I think the church is going to have to deal with?
Yeah.
So, over the last couple of years, at this point, roughly 1/3 of homosexuality is based on not a single gene, but a series of genes. So, homosexuality is in part, it can be a result of early childhood experience, but up to 1/3 of homosexuality is already been attributed to a series of genes, right? Now, we already have the ability to genetically alter ourselves through CRISPR-Cas9 technology, right? Medical professionals. The church is very soon going to have to come out with a position and a stance on whether it is okay to genetically alter a fetus before they're born to alter the sin, to remove the sin out of them. Those are things, and I'm a futurist, so this is the type of stuff that I
yeah.
think about.
That would
But
be
these are things
fascinating.
that the scriptures written 2,000 years ago, or 200 years ago, or whatever you believe, don't have answers to. There's no answers to stuff like that.
Well, there kind of is. I will disagree, and I'll let you go right
go
after it. Is that I disagree that they will have to, and the reason is because I believe that I'm having deja vu right now. This is weird.
Oh, dude,
But
powerful.
I-
That's the spirit.
It has to do with it's a question of eternity rather than a question of the time being. Meaning, I don't believe that if you have homosexual feelings, and I'm pretty sure the church's stance is the same. If you have those feelings, it's not a sin, right?
But you have to go through life without love.
Without a
Romantic
partner,
love.
much like me.
Right.
I don't have a partner. But I believe that's the
difference-
question.
the
The
difference
question
being you
is
have
what
hope for a partner,
is
right?
is right, and the question is homosexuality an eternal thing or not? And that's the real discussion. And I don't think the church will necessarily address the feelings or the inherent homosexuality that people experience on earth, because I think their position is that it is a temporal thing.
Well, okay, let's remove homosexuality from it. Okay, the alternate scenario, and me and all my siblings have ADHD, and none of us are part of the church anymore or believe in the church. I'll rephrase that. And
ADHD
my
being
premise or
reason.
hypothesis is that obedience is in part genetic. So, removing homosexuality, right? If my parents know before, or if I know my child before he or she is born is going to have a lower likelihood of being obedient, right? And we're taught that this is the only time that we have to prove that we're worthy of celestial glory, right? Which may or may not be true. Is it a parent's duty to make sure at any cost their child arrives
So I-
to the celestial kingdom.
Yeah,
Therefore, is it okay to genetically alter the potential of sin or the probability of sin out of them?
So I'm not the church, so I
point.
won't speak for the church, but I think that, I mean, I think you're, and you acknowledge that you're a futurist, so you're thinking very far ahead. I think that even from a doctrinal standpoint, I can't, and I don't know, but I see that if you're looking at altering behavioral markers in genetics, I also feel like that's in a way meddling with agency. And I
Right.
don't think the church
Sure.
would be cool with that. I don't
But
think,
as a parent, how do you say
if I was a
you
parent
have
and
to
I
be
knew,
okay with your
if
child
I was a
not
parent-
getting to
if
the
I was a
celestial
parent and I had
kingdom?
a child developing in the womb and they could scientifically prove to me, hey, just so you know, your child is going to be homosexual, or they will have a low obedience marker score.
The likelihood, the probability, right?
whatever,
Not-
whatever. Let's just say that it's scientifically presented to me in whatever context. So let's say like we advance and it's like Gattaca, and you can have designer babies and you can pick exactly what you want or whatever.
Which is just a matter of time.
Sure. I call me a romantic. I would not. But here's the thing, though, is if they said, hey, he'll have cystic fibrosis unless you change a few things, I would say I'm cool with that.
Yeah.
Take the
Interesting.
take the cystic fibrosis away, but who they are as a person, which can be impacted by the
Cystic
diseases that they're
fibrosis.
that they're given, and that's a challenge. I admittedly, if it was a
it was autism
genetic
or cystic
malady of a
fibrosis.
physical nature where they wouldn't be considered normal in terms of their physical abilities, I would be for that.
Sure.
But if it was a behavioral thing where I'm trying to mess around with their personality, I would not feel comfortable with that, and I would want to leave it. Even if I knew that
So
it would be
as a
against my
parent,
religious beliefs, I wouldn't
knowing-
want to touch it.
Knowing that the likelihood is extremely high that your child is going to burn in hell forever.
I think that's a
You're
funny
saying
conclusion because as a member of the church, like I don't believe that somebody born with a homosexual attraction is destined for hell. I don't believe that.
Sure.
I don't
don't
believe
believe
that. I
it
don't
either.
believe that at all.
Oh, well, that's not what I'm saying.
You
Here-
said that if I knew that the
Okay, we
child would
removed the
burn in
whole-
hell, like
Okay,
because they would
okay.
be born.
Okay, let's rephrase.
Okay.
Right, we already removed the homosexual example out the window.
Okay.
Right, we're just talking about obedience here.
Oh yeah.
So
Especially the
let's
obedience
not say
marker. Would not be
rot
cool with
or
that.
burn in hell. Let's just say if I knew that my child was going to miss out on all the extravagant, ecstasy of the celestial kingdom
Mm-hmm.
and live in an ordinary place that is good, but nowhere near where I want it to, knowing that my child would miss out on
Mm-hmm.
all that, I'm supposed to just be okay knowing that that's probably where my child is going to go.
Well, I mean, if you're diving into that, I mean, I think you're kind of couching that as potentially how you perceive God's approach to us. That he sees these kids and he has children, and they're like, oh, well, some of them aren't going to make it. Well, that's okay. Let's push go on this humanity experiment. I think what's really going on there, and again, if you really want to get into it, and this is my short answer, and again, maybe this might be something I need to think about some more, but we forget about the atonement of Jesus Christ in this context. Of, as far as we're concerned, the first estate, referring to the pre-earth life, has happened, and that being able to even come to this planet and receive a body, again, I'm talking about LDS doctrine,
Right.
is a great blessing, a wonderful opportunity to be able to feel, literally, life as an embodied soul.
Sure.
I would say, great. I'd rather they had their second estate than didn't get a body. Now, then we could go into a debate of, oh, well, if you abort the child or abort the embryo, does that mean that soul doesn't get their chance, or does God have a workaround where it's like, oh, well, you didn't get a body here, but we'll throw you into this one, and they'll still get their chance? Like, what power do we have to frustrate? If God wants a soul to be here and have a body, he's probably going to make it happen if we accept the fact that God is all powerful and that this is indeed his plan, right?
Right.
So for me,
All based on
I don't see that as a condemnation, because as a Christian, I believe that Christ overcame death and sin, and I believe that because of him, maybe in the Mormon theology, you don't get the highest degree, like the extra credit points kingdom, but you're still going to be glorified and you're going to be happy. I don't see that as a bad thing.
You little bitch.
So because I wanted to go down the tangent of what was aforementioned, previously mentioned of agency. And I think there's a big misconception in the church and out of the church as to what agency actually means. And for me, so in the church, we grew up being taught that we all have our agency. And I was always under the assumption that's like, okay, the bum that grew up in the ghetto has the same choices as I do in Alpine to be just as good of a person. So therefore, I'm doing better, you know? And it carries with it this innate sense of pride. But what I understand, it's a superiority thing. And having gone through
world class for life, by the way.
Right. Lone Peak High School. Okay. We'll cut that out.
No, now we're
I edit these things. It's good that I am the most embarrassing one. But as for as of late, or I guess in the last 10 years, having experienced a decent amount of pain, I come to acknowledge that the gift of choice, as we teach it in the church, may be misunderstood, and it was by me, so it certainly is misunderstood by some, but it's not about everybody has the same choices. It's that every single individual is given a set of choices, and they can choose what to do with those choices. For example, I have the choice to build a rock climbing wall in my shed, but I don't have the choice to play in the NBA. I just don't have that choice, no matter how hard I work. So I'm given a few different choices.
Muggsy Bogues was 6
and the
inches
fact
shorter
that you're
than us.
you're like retirement age for the NBA.
Muggsy.
Yeah, and I'm pretty much a retirement age.
And also, you
The
can
eldest
jump
here.
or could jump really high.
You could.
They called me Hughley Hops back in 5th grade. It was big. I was popular.
Hughley Hops.
Hughley Hops. So what I guess I'm saying is that we each have a number of choices that we are given. And so in this scenario in which we might be able to genetically change, say, future behavioral skills or whatever it might be in our children, that also is on the playing field of choices being given to us. And in my own personal belief, I believe that we will be judged according to what we have been given personally.
Choices that have been given to us.
Given to us, because as an embryo, I'm not the one that chooses the future behavioral
I like it.
abilities that I'm given. So I believe that kind of changes the whole dynamic on agency, because agency is a personal, individual thing, not a all-encompassing, I have the same choices as Zach, because I don't.
So
and Zach doesn't have the same choices as me.
Can we illustrate this in an example? And I think you and I talked about this
Right.
a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
So-
actually, it came up in my mind when we were...
So, obviously in the Mormon faith, we, believe in the law of chastity, and kind of part of that is we believe that it's not good to look at pornography. Excuse you, sir.
What?
Were you trying to hide it, or was that an
How
intentional-
dare you
I feel like I
defile?
heard
That was a little bit of an entertainment
that, like,
experiment.
echoed in my
Could
head.
this be
Yeah.
good for the podcast?
I felt
By the
so-
way, Bean Burrito, my bad.
Dude,
Thoughts on our thoughts?
I felt it in the
So,
Hey,
okay.
shut
So,
that door.
so here's
open
an
it.
example, right, that we can use, I think.
Yeah.
So, let's say hypothetically, not hypothetically, it's true. So, my natural testosterone levels are low. Kind of low end of normal.
Oh, I won't say the number.
Right?
Sorry.
Yeah. It wasn't as erected. as it
And
usually is.
let's say hypothetically that your testosterone levels are correlated to
Directly.
your likelihood to look at pornography, right?
Got it.
So let's say Jordan's testosterone levels are through the roof,
extremely high.
and he's watching porn
I'm not
every second he
I'm-
can. Right?
I'm the guy in the porn videos.
He's
Let's be honest.
the pizza delivery boy. So
guy that doesn't know what
so
a vagina looks like, that might.
the way that you
I've been
So-
I've been on that train
there it
for a
is.
while, and
Okay.
there it is. And
So-
this is the last time I will mention that. I apologize to Zach and the audience.
sorry, Mom.
How often are you two talking about
Okay.
this?
Zach,
So-
I haven't
Actually
seen
had
your vagina
more than
yet.
a handful.
Can,
of
can I keep
conversations.
going?
Please.
Okay.
A fistful.
So in this example, right?
yeah.
Or based on what you're saying, so your predisposed likelihood to look at pornography, which is a bad behavior, is very high. My predisposition to look at pornography is very low. Therefore, could you potentially, looking at pornography regularly, be more the hypothetical scenario, right? Could you be more worthy of the celestial kingdom than me, even though you're breaking the rule and I am not?
Absolutely. I believe
I
that.
think that even with that thought experiment, I mean, it's
It's
a
a
great
yes or no
question.
answer, Zach. It's pretty simple. Is
Hey,
the moon
what's-
made out of cheese?
but you
What's with the
can-
black
you
and
can
white
go down the road of
questioning? Yes or no on
justification.
such a fundamental
Zach,
question.
I'm sorry.
All
I was
really
the
have
little
to
bitch
say-
there. I'm sorry. It's late. I get angry.
He's a real fan of that work.
Yeah.
Anyways, no, I think that.
You know,
I mean, for
bleep
me,
sound.
I'm thinking, wow, dude, you're like asking somebody to answer a question that's like one of the few things that the church doesn't even pretend to know.
Right.
Like exactly what the benchmarks
true.
will be and
That's
the
true.
considerations made
Right.
when somebody's
It
standing
will be
before the
perfectly
judgment bar
just.
of Christ.
That's true.
It will be
Like-
perfectly fair.
Like, I don't think that would even be remotely encouraged that there would come some moment where in the bishop's handbook they have
Right.
like this,
Like, here's
Like,
exactly where you're
do some
you're
blood
going.
tests.
Right.
Okay. Then after that, we need to get a psych evaluation on each member, and then we'll give them an adjusted score on their propensity towards lust.
So your
So-
score to
so
get in
you're
could
talking
be
about Jordan
10,000.
with
Mine could be
So
5,000.
Jordan's sporting a lust score of 9 out of 10.
it's big.
You know what's funny
Which-
though?
which-
What's funny about this whole conversation is the fact
Let's
that
say libido,
they-
okay, guys?
they don't go as
It's
far as
extreme.
saying we know where you'll go, but they go as far as saying we know
that
that this is how it will be.
yeah.
These three kingdoms, and also 3 tiers in the top kingdom. You know what I'm saying?
Three
You know what I mean?
inside the
We're-
top
we're
of the
not
three.
Specific, we're not specific on where you'll be, but we are specific on like what it will be.
options?
Yeah, what your options will be.
Great job
which
at
is an
getting in
interesting
the top,
which
but
is an interesting thing to me.
Well, and it's also interesting some of the things Joseph Smith talked about between, progression between kingdoms, but
Right,
that's
right.
kind of a different topic. I wanted to.
Those- yeah, we
I'm
have
a
so
huge
many.
fan of.
Yeah, we have a lot. I wanted to say real quick on that whole realm, if I can bring it back to
Yeah.
the forefront of my mind. I'm forgetting it actually. What were we just talking about?
We were just talking about
Agency.
kingdoms, agency,
Agency.
You were
Thought
talking about
experiment,
thought experiment,
Yeah.
judgment of God.
No,
vagina.
No, yeah. There it
you
is.
wanna go- if you
That's
wanna-
what it reminds. I want to bring it back to sexy back.
Can we
okay?
go back to the birth canal?
I'm bringing sexy
In
back.
more than one way.
No, have you guys read The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis?
I have.
I have
I have
not.
not.
Oh.
No.
Highly recommend it.
And Mere Christianity.
so
Both
much
of those are
Christianity,
We have
great.
phenomenal.
so much homework.
But I love in The Great Divorce how many surprises there are.
Mhm.
And it really comes down to C.S. Lewis's knowledge or understanding of Jesus Christ and our imperfection is really profound. He has a lot of gravitas. But it basically, in that book, he gives multiple scenarios of how really all it comes down to is letting go of your pride of what you think you did and just accepting God, accepting Jesus Christ, and accepting what is, and letting it all go. And there's a scenario in there where there's a murderer who murdered someone, and then I think his boss or somebody, the wife of the person he murdered, couldn't let go, couldn't forgive him, but he personally was able to let go of all his pride, and he went on to the
The great unknown.
great unknown.
So it's like the
And it's-
parable of like the debtor where he had like the fat debt.
yeah.
But,
Right. Yes, exactly. So there will be surprises, as he says in Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
And
Which I
I
think
think
is
there's going to be
phenomenal.
actually more surprises than not surprises. The
I
first
thi-
will be last, and the last
I've said it
shall
a
pick their
million
nose.
times. I really think afterlife, whatever it is,
If
I
there
think it's
is
gonna,
an
I think it's
afterlife.
going to be very, very different than any of us expected.
I mean, we're thinking good place different.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be awesome.
So I've
love that.
got
They were all bad.
so I've got kind of a tangent thought on your thought. So
Dude,
thought on his
wait, that's a
thoughts.
toot.
That's
So-
a tangential toot.
so
That's a
kind of
Thoughts on his thoughts, his toes.
popular topic right now in the field of psychology is the topic of, or the concept, the free will illusion, which is starting to gain more traction. Which is the hypothesis is that we only feel like we have free will
Right.
or agency.
Yeah, this is Sam Harris
And
thing.
there's some evidence in the brain that the brain fires up, and by studying the brain, someone looking at your brain scans can tell what decision you're going to make before you even know. I think the free will illusion is a very useful tool, whether it is true or not, because what the free will illusion suggests is that someone who is homeless, if you were born, if you had the same exact nature and nurture, meaning if you were born with the same exact genes in the same exact experience and had all the same experiences during the life, you would be in the exact same position that that person would.
Right.
It's very useful because anything good that I do in my life, I realize that anybody else would be achieving the same amount that I am today. It's just that I was born with my genes and given my experiences to get there. And at the same time, it is beneficial to forgive oneself, accepting the possibility that anybody else with my same genes and my same life experience would also make that similar mistake. So whether
Yeah.
it's true or not, who knows?
Well, I
I would
it's-
love
it's
to
a
have an
useful
episode
tool.
dedicated
I've delved a
exclusively
bit into
to
that
free will
with
and
like
kind of
Sam
talk
Harris.
about that.
He's kind of
Yeah,
big into
yeah,
the,
he talks
the
about it
free
quite a
will
bit.
delusion, but I'm there on board with it to an extent of probabilities, not to an extent of
knowing
you don't
exactly
have choice.
what. Yeah, yeah.
Because that would be a pretty black and white. If it was true, that would be interesting. If that was true,
There we
Ah.
go. There he is. I couldn't
See,
hear
you were
him.
in the gray area over there. You know, as you
Sorry.
said, black and white. It was
no,
like,
I think that
this is
if it was proven to be true, that would fundamentally alter a lot of perceptions and
And I think a lot of things over time in the church that we can discuss over time also is that our fundamental beliefs have changed in significant ways
Oh, yeah.
inside of the church and will continue to change in significant ways over time, which I think is a wonderful thing. You know what I mean? Like, it should change.
But
There are things
it
that should
puts
change.
it puts the black and white question of is this true or not at risk,
Yes.
because it clouds it, right? Because it
Makes it
makes
dangerous.
every time something changes, it triggers to the brain, this is not true, not this is true. Because if it was true and now it's not true anymore, then it's all
I think
not
it just depends on the thing, though, because I mean, we could look at, interestingly enough, we can look at missionary work compared to 30 years ago.
Significant changes.
Like you talked about being specific, and we're referencing like the exact recounting of the first vision is definitely very specific, but you could definitely say that missionary work and how it's done is less specific now because you don't just have discussion 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
yeah, it's more broad.
You can
have
you can
open
hop
discussions,
around
yeah.
and who knows how thorough the missionaries are being.
Well, that's-
who knows like
that's
that
more
kind of a
that's
thing.
more application rather than actual doctrine.
Which is fair to say, but at the same time, that was introduced new, and I think even within the church, it was, you could say, marketed or presented as a championing evidence of the restoring church, of an
See,
evolving
I
church.
I don't see that as proof either way, because like the behaviors and the way that people live the gospel is going to change based on the circumstances, right? I think it's more in kind of fundamental doctrine where those things, where the black and white is really, the contrast is there. You know, for example, I think in, Jeffrey R. Holland in, I think, 1978 made some comments about the only people who were able to live in the Americas were God's chosen people, right? I would consider that what we would consider doctrine if it's coming out of one of the apostles' mouths, right? Now,
You would consider that doctrine?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's closer than the way that we do missionary work.
Doctrine.
Right.
But so if he says it was, only God's children that were able to come here, God's chosen people, right? And then now, fast forward a couple of decades, now we've got kind of genetic, a genetic look into Native Americans, and guess what? There's genetic markers that suggest that the likelihood only 3% of people, 3% of Native Americans could have come from Lehi's family through the Middle East, got on a boat, and the likelihood of that 3% actually coming through that channel is very low. So the likelihood of that happening is extremely small. And so the what I would consider doctrine of Jeffrey R. Holland saying no one could live here unless they were God's people, and now it's a question of, well, there's a really small chance of 3% of the Native Americans actually being God's
and that's
people.
another good talking point in the future, because we can talk about the evolution of the Book of Mormon introductory page, how it once said the principal ancestors to
Evolution.
now some of the ancestors.
Among the ancestors.
Yep.
But I think almost a better illustration of what you're trying to say.
Always trying to
doctrinal
one-up
changes-
me, dude.
I am. But like polygamy, I think would be a fascinating topic to talk about at some point.
yeah.
Because right now, a lot of people I think would say, well, polygamy is not a doctrine that we hold to be true. However, it's still in our Doctrine and Covenants, right? Which is a fascinating, like Section 132 is all about polygamy, and we do believe in polygamy after this life. Whether we want to admit that as Mormons, we do.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely do, and that for me is kind of that's an uncomfortable doctrine, but we had to change that due to laws. Right.
No, and
over time,
there's been some really interesting. I was watching a video on YouTube from a Christian pastor talking about polygamy.
Yeah.
Because there's polygamy in the Old Testament, and his analysis of the existence of polygamy in the Old Testament was that it was God's way of showing us that polygamy doesn't work.
Which is, I think, an interesting...
Because he talked about how David,
That's
you can have wives and concubines, and it's still not enough because he still wanted Bathsheba, the wife of another man, and
always
first did some deceitful acts to get him killed.
One of the challenges that I have with the gospel is that the gospel that we understand, I think, is very much placed in the context of the world between 1800 and 2020 now, right? For example, marriage being an act of love has really only existed in the last 150 years since Jane Austen novels, right? We have a peek into...
she is the mother of romance.
We have a peek
Big
into...
ups to Jane. Sorry.
So we have a peek into... I think it's fairly conclusive, at least with experts, that humans evolved over hundreds of thousands or millions of years in small groups, limited by essentially the Dunbar's number, less than 150 people, for various reasons. And we have a peek into what these people were like, because there are still some hunter-gatherer tribes that exist today, right? Dr. Chris Ryan, Tangentially Speaking podcast, talks a lot about this. Talks about a couple of tribes that he or friends of his have visited in the Amazon that have very little contact from the outside world, right? And in terms of their sexual policy, right, and how they exist,
no policy.
There is so there's this interesting belief where if a woman wants a child who is funny and tall and strong, she goes and has sex with the funny guy and the tall guy and the strong guy. Guess what? And none of those
me and then you would be having
none of those men
again,
have ownership over that child. There's relatively no concept of ownership, right? Because it's a collectivist society rather than an individualist society, right? So the concept that we believe in terms of marriage and partnerships and polygamy, I think really exists only the only reason that it's a concern and confusing to us is because it's placed in the world in which we know, which is you get married to one person and you have to love them, and you own and they own each other's sexuality.
I have a question about that with regards to romanticism, though, because that was around, I'd say, 1600s or just post 1600, like Renaissance era. Why did it resonate so much with us? Like, obviously, previously to that, it was like a matter of survival. I would say that
Marriage was survival.
Yeah,
Correct.
and
Or
monogamy
political, or-
monogamy was a better way to go about society, and people recognized that even pre Jesus Christ. But why did it resonate so much with kind of the human spirit?
I think the developing mind. I think
what was that about?
I just think it's
Was
the
it a developing
mind.
mind, or
No,
was it like
I-
something deeper spiritually? Or,
No,
I'm open
I
to
think it's-
I'm open to
anything.
either
So
of those
I
as
think
well.
I think it's neither. So the United States and the modern world as we know it is built around the idea of individualism, right? Which is I am responsible for my own self, and I pick myself up by my bootstraps, and I succeed or fail based on my own work.
Correct.
And so in the world in which we know success is I have things that are mine and no one else's. I have my house, I have my spouse, I have my kids, right? Whereas in hunter-gatherer societies and in the past, it was very much a communal, this is ours, we are in this together. And I do think that romantic, monogamous relationships were a result or were caused by the shift from collectivist societies to 12,000 years ago hitting the agricultural revolution, and now we're in kind of an individualistic society where we own our property, our spouse, our kids, and our stuff. I think that's my hypothesis or premise, as the philosophy YouTube videos would say.
You know, a very good video on YouTube actually
What's
would be
what's the conclusion though?
The desire for romantic love, as you were saying, the need to have a spouse and essentially own each other's sexuality and be a complete partner is a result of no longer relying on other people to survive physically or
which you can
mentally and
trace
emotionally.
back to essentially it kind of began with Jesus Christ, and then Renaissance, then the U.S. Constitution, and then now, and I would say that could be seen as, or another term for it would be a higher law, is the individuality of people, the worth of souls.
Well, sorry to disagree with you again. I know I'm very opinionated when it comes to this topic, but individualism is pretty shitty.
Oh, really?
I mean, guess what? We have more stuff. We have, better houses and more technology and more stuff that is ours. And everything that individualism tells us that success is, we have it more now than we've ever had it.
So could
And
you
guess
say
what?
that-
The rates of disconnectedness from other people, depression, anxiety, suicide is higher than it's ever been before. And because we no longer have close relationships like we used to.
But I would
they're
say-
individuals connecting with other people. What
And
do you
that's
say?
collectivism.
Yeah, but it's not it's still individual choice and individual, like the higher law that I would suggest it would be called, and then we connect with other people as part of our individualism.
I think the interesting thing
Well,
about
that's
all this
collectivism.
is the fact that you talk about this. And this is another thing that I'd like to talk about. Is
Interdependency.
this progression that you say exists towards individualism, coinciding with a departure from traditional religious thought, may I mean, that just makes me think of, in Christianity, the core beliefs of Christianity is love God, love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
In your words, I believe, a collectivist view of you have duties to some that are more significant than others, but ultimately, like, we are to love our neighbors, to love one another. So, I mean, I see an antidote to maybe the individualistic maladies of today as Christianity. That's of course my biased belief, my propositional attitude of belief towards the Christian message. But I mean, I think that almost kind of walks right into the need for a compelling belief that prompts you to seek outside yourself. Now, you guys have already expressed your own opinions, regardless of a religious view. You've already said that you believe that it's. We know that if you serve, it releases oxytocin, and that you feel closer to the divine when you express and feel love with your kids and your wife. And so I don't want to say that like religious thought and religious activities have cornered the market on actions and activities that yield oxytocin or love or collectivism. But I mean, I just think that, right off the bat, there's something that it offers.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think many of the things that the church and the gospel offers are now things that are offered in political groups, in rooting for the same sports team and having tribes that way. I feel like there's lots of spiritual experiences that are now gained through other religions. And we can dive into that at another point in time.
I think that's just because
but
you define like a significant release of oxytocin and happiness, camaraderie, and joy as what we would call the spirit.
Yeah.
But we would then also argue that we feel that there is a differentiation between feeling good, feeling together, feeling like your understanding is growing, and like a spiritual message. But again, that's probably something that can be debated quite a bit.
So let's bring this back and let's wrap.
I don't want to bring it back.
Let's bring this back and let's
It's
wrap
11
up.
o'clock and I'm tired.
Let's wrap up. I do want to say one final thing about this whole idea, because I feel like there's been a ton of discussion, and bringing it back to the very first quote you read, right? Black and white,
Yeah.
and knowing that it's all white or it's all black, right? So I don't know if you guys have heard of Richard Rohr before. Has anyone heard of Richard Rohr?
Classy last name, though.
It's a pretty cool last name. So he's a Franciscan friar. He lives in
that's even
Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Jeepers.
But he's like Roman Catholic, popular author. I love him. He's a fantastic like author. And this quote, particularly from him, about the idea of not knowing, was a really fascinating thing for me. And this will be my closing remarks. But here's what he says. It's amazing how religion has turned the biblical idea of faith around 180 degrees into a need and even a right to certain knowing, complete predictability, and perfect assurance about whom and what God likes or doesn't like.
Dogmatism.
Why do we think we can have the infinite mystery of God in our quite finite pocket? We supposedly know what God is going to say or do next because we think our particular denomination has it all figured out. In this schema, God is no longer free, but must follow our rules and our theology. If God is not infinitely free, we are in trouble. Because every time God forgives or shows mercy, God is breaking God's own rules with shocking but merciful freedom and inconsistency. And he continues, I'll finish with, we do need enough knowing to be able to hold our ground. We need a container and structure in which we can safely acknowledge that we do know a bit. In fact, just enough to hold us until we are ready for further knowing. And so, for me, that really resonates. That whole thing
like
really
that.
resonates because I feel like we paint ourselves in a corner again. If we claim to know, we are not opening ourselves up to opportunities for further knowing.
Yeah.
like the further light and knowledge idea, which I think is a beautiful idea that is taught in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I think it needs to be emphasized more than this is the only true and we know it, because I feel like that will close us down to opportunities for learning and growth and progression.
I agree that we should move more towards belief, and one of the most memorable experiences that I've had in a sacrament meeting was when a person who I respected got up and said, "I believe." And I remember a talk specifically by Elder Holland when he talked about an experience with a young man or some young person saying like, "Hey, I believe, but I don't know if I know," or whatever. And he says, "I hugged that guy till his eyes bulged out," or something.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I remember that.
again, I'm not saying that to say, oh, and he believes it, but I mean, I think that there is definitely space even from the top of the church that says like faith is enough.
Yeah.
And again, going back to my opening, conversation is that I think faith is huge, and I think that whether somebody prescribes to any faith, we're all using faith every day.
Yeah.
But I would also say that there definitely is, I think, a growing fear, almost a repugnance towards any truth claim of any kind. I think that as soon as somebody says, "I know something," they say, "Oh, well, then you don't think you can learn more." And specifically in the Book of Mormon and Alma 32, it talks about how you can develop your faith in something to the point of your knowledge being perfect. It even says that.
Right.
And again, like this is me using something
Right.
like that, but I think it's interesting that it specifically addresses that, the progression from faith to knowledge, but that your knowledge is only in that one thing, that one principle, that one element. And so I think that there might be those who have a knowledge of certain principles in life. Like you would even say, I've heard you say both a couple times, like, "I don't know anything, but I know what a good life looks like," or something to that nature.
So I think there's a distinction between absolute knowledge
And we'll talk about that later. But I just, again, I'm simply saying that, we do throw it around, and however we're employing the word, of course,
Right,
can be
right.
debated. But I do think that there is a fear and almost not a resentment, but just kind of like a sensitivity, a trigger around somebody saying that like they wholeheartedly believe and or know that a certain principle or activity or action
Or
is a
truth
good
claim
thing.
is true, yeah.
And if you were to hold a gun to their head and say, "Would you bet your life on this thing?" Like, I think there are plenty of times at any given moment somebody's like, "Yeah, I would."
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I feel like it's so hard to wrap it up.
And
but
the struggle with that is sometimes you're not holding all the cards.
I don't think we ever will.
I don't think I ever will. I don't think any of us will ever hold all the cards to the point where, but yet some people would put the gun to their head. Some people, or have someone shoot them saying, "I know this." Or some people might even fly planes into buildings because of what they know.
But I don't think that'll go
conviction.
away either.
Right.
And for better and for the obvious worse. Like, I
Right.
think that that's part of being human, is we will believe something so much that as far as we're concerned, however we label it, it operates as a truth or a knowledge in our mind.
Right.
And
And something could be true for me that's maybe not true for somebody else.
And that's where the absolutes come in, because I could say, I know that eating healthy makes me feel better most of the time. That's a knowledge statement, right? That's an absolute statement, but the bounds on that are very loose, right? Versus I know that there's a 12-point deer standing 6 feet that way right at this moment. I mean,
You saw it in your tombstone.
they're pretty different.
Look through his hat,
And-
saw through right through the door.
And I don't know, when truth claims go to that degree of specificity and absoluteness, then yes, I think it is
It's a
dangerous.
little itchy. It's a little
yeah.
itchy, especially when truth claims are surrounding ideas that have been debated and not understood by
Sure.
everyone since the very beginning. Where
Yeah.
things like, where do we come from? Where do we go after we die? What is God? You know what I mean? What is the nature of God? Like, these are the questions everyone's been debating forever. So specific truth claims around that can get a little
Since
itchy.
Socrates, right?
Well, I just think that I think that theoretically, if somebody did possess the knowledge of the nature of God, the environment and the reactions would be the same.
Yeah.
Like, let's say theoretically that like the Buddhists have it right,
Right.
or
Which
as
would
we
be
said,
awesome. Their teachings are amazing.
or as we said in a previous conversation,
Maze balls.
Veronica the Dolphin.
Right.
The doctrine and the eternal teachings of Veronica the
Flying
Dolphin are the right
spaghetti
thing, right?
monster. Yeah.
Like, the reality is, to those who would either happen upon it or believe in it enough to where those principles dictate their life in such a way that it grants them that thing, then there would be people who'd be like, but you can't know. You can't know. How can you know? And they'll give their experience and be like, well, that's not enough for me. I don't understand that. That's not how I perceive God.
Right.
And you're putting God in a box, and this is such a bold claim. I just don't know what gives you the confidence that could be true. But theoretically, if it is true, what more can you do or say?
Well, this has been a wonderful. This has been a wonderful opening discussion. Right?
I agree.
You feel? You feel? I feel.
It'll be interesting to see it play
Well,
back for ourselves.
If
Yeah,
you feel
yeah.
that,
And
does
again,
that
if anybody
mean
is-
that it was
Do you
wonderful.
know
watching
it?
this and feeling
Spencer,
strongly,
do you know that it was wonderful?
I feel it.
then feel
I
free to
know that
comment.
it was good. I
welcome
do
it.
not know that it was wonderful.
Well, thank you. Goodbye. Are we? Let's end it.
Are we?
This has
I
been
think
Into
I'll-
the Maelstrom.
Can we do a little harmony?
Exercise.
Wow.